gentle appeal. And I'm going to spend the night at the head of Loch as the Prince did. It was from here he began his epic mountain marches to outwit the enemy, first by Glen Peen to reach Loch Mora, then Glen Beesdale to a cave in the sea, a journey seldom walked by anyone to this day, and certainly never filmed before. Aye, this is all that remains of the house of Donald Cameron of Kinlochar Caig. And what excitement there must have been that night when he heard the sound of voices, the sound of horses. The party that came in were 4 very weary men, tired out. No wonder, 48 hours after Culloden, here was the Prince and 3 companions. And of course they were hoping that they might hear news of what had happened at Culloden. Donald Cameron didn't even know that Culloden had been fought and was a disaster, and the Prince was on his way to escape somewhere. Still, the Prince waited all next day, hoping for news that the clans had rallied and that the fight could be carried on. But the Prince had given no orders for a rendezvous point, so he had no way of contacting them. Some of the army were at Ruthven Barracks away down on Badenoch. So I think it was then the Prince made his decision that he would have to clear out quickly. But the only way out was through the rough bounds of Moidart to the west. I first came to this country when I was a boy of 16. In one way I was like Prince Charlie. I too was looking for an escape from the tenements of Glasgow, and I certainly found it here.
Moidart, a wild country between Loch Nevis and Loch Hourn. But for me, the real delight was that the country was absolutely empty. I craved it. I didn't have any kind of insight into history at all. This was the world I wanted, just to be, I suppose, an animal living in a marvellous world. In fact, I described myself later as all body and no brains. A couple of magnificent wild goats up there, real hairy jobs with tremendous sweat-back horns. Well, it's the kind of thing you expect to find in a place like this, although usually when it's just as wet as this, the wild goat doesn't do so well. And this is one of the wettest parts of Scotland. No wonder the Prince's party said it was the cruellest road they'd ever seen below the wildest peaks in Scotland. I think he had a point there. Anyhow, I got to know a climbing man, this butcher friend of mine, Matt Forrester. Oh, he seemed to me to have the wisdom of the ages. He was older than me, I think he'd be 19. And Matt seemed to have walked everywhere. Like me, he'd taken to the hills by himself. He had been to Moidart too. And it was he who gradually unfolded to me the thing that was missing in my life, namely, any kind of interpretation of the landscape. And once we did a trip from Glenfinnan together, right over the hills and out by Lochar Caig, and it was then when he started to talk to me about the events of the 45, brought home that Charlie virtually was the first mountaineer to explore this country. I had never thought of the Prince as a mountaineer, but the more I read about the Prince, I thought, well, he's an odd character right enough. Matt, incidentally, didn't like him much. He thought he was a right scunner.
Well, Matt was a real outdoor type. He couldn't be doing with any kind of romantic nonsense like Bonnie Charlie's New Awa and all that stuff. A sudden change of character in the glen. It's closing in. It was wide and boggy to begin with. Now it looks firmer, steeper and rockier.
So I saw Charlie as something rather different from Matt. And I believe that when Charlie came here first, he was rather like me when I came here first. And he didn't have much imagination. He accepted whatever he found. After all, look at the Prince arriving in Scotland with only 7 men, no money, very little in the way of arms and ammunition. And yet he managed to raise an army of wild clansmen who couldn't agree with each other, but they followed him. And he virtually walked through Scotland, went into England and marched right down to Derby. And then on retreat, they never lost a battle. And the Highlanders did marvellously, despite the fact that I suppose they were ill-disciplined and everything else. And it was the events following Culloden, once that disastrous battle had taken place, and Cumberland had it its own way, and no doubt the Highlanders were seen as a fifth column, and that the only good Highlander was a dead one. So that while Charlie was walking through this country, wounded men were being rounded up in the field of Culloden and spiked to death. People were pulled out of fields and shot. Women were raped. Houses were burned. The idea was to teach the Highlanders a lesson. So I started to look at this country a different way. When I saw these ruins, I thought of the people who lived here and who managed to win a living from this wildest country, wettest country in Scotland, herding their black cattle, growing a little oats to keep them. It must have been a very, very hard life indeed, and this is, I think, what made them great soldiers.
Well, this is worth a walk. Lochan, Lewham and Saggart. It means the loch of the priest's leap, but nobody knows who the priest was. Fine big waterfall on that side. And apparently there's no easy way here, but I know there's a path on the left-hand side. And if it was getting dark when the prince was here, I can understand why he felt it such a terrible road, because he left the head of Kinlochardkig at 5 o'clock at night, so it'd be getting on by the time he got here. Well, this is one striking scene. We've seen how the valley narrowed. Now it's broad for a wee bit, and it's narrowing again, I can see.
And when I came to the hills first, I thought of all this as ancient history. In fact, I thought of the First World War as ancient history. I was only 16 when I started going to the hills in real earnest. My father was killed in 1916. But 1916 seemed to me as remote as the Ice Age away. In fact, when my mother used to say, "I hope you'll never be a soldier," I tended to think she had an awful long memory, you know.
That's a funny thing, as you get older, history seems to draw closer. But it was never more so than one day with my pal Matt, when we met an old man who started telling us about his folks. He said I could remember his father telling him about a granduncle who had fought with a prince at Culloden, and he regaled us with details of the battle, as if he'd actually seen it himself. It made a great impression on me because suddenly I realised that it hadn't happened all that long ago. That was really thrilling across the steep hillside there. Quite moody too, because the day's changed a bit since the morning. Began a bit too bright. Now it's darkened down a bit, and something ahead looks very good because the traverse is taking me into a wee corrie. It's marked on the map, Corrie Vey. So I'll be dropping into that and through the Narrows and soon in the crest of the pass.
And if anything came out of the disaster of Culloden, that something was the loyalty of the Highlanders. The fact that they gave their all to the prince. The prince escaped, but they didn't. They were the victims ever afterwards. In fact, it was only the ability of the Highlandmen as soldiers that 40 years after Culloden made them so valuable, because then they were integrated into the Highland regiments and won honours in every battlefield that was ever fought. And it was then the government started to think in terms of not getting rid of the Highlanders, but trying to keep them in the Highlands. The Caledonian Canal was built to teach them the habits of industry. What an idea. Leisure is seen as a very desirable thing. The Highlanders knew it a long time ago. That was the thing they valued more than anything. Freedom was life itself to them. I started life in a grocer's shop, born a man and died a grocer. My ambition was to get away from it, to break it and